Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Um, Thank you for joining us today. My name is Brian Waite, and I have a couple different roles on campus. I'm the department chair of secondary and special education over in the School of Education. I'm also the director of the GI program, which stands for Global Intercultural Initiative on campus. And today I just am kind of playing the role of moderator. I've been asked to join this fantastic group of professionals, and they have an amazing presentation for you today to go along with Ethics Awareness Week. And so let me just kind of give a quick overview of who our guest speakers are today, and then I'll turn the time over to them for a more formal introduction. So we are joined today by Axel Ramirez, Dale Cox, and Kaylee Crandall. And they are all professors over in the School of Education. Axel Ramirez has been at UVU for so many years, we have lost count. And he is going, the theme of this session is keeping the peace in the hallways and classrooms. And so each one of our speakers is going to address the issues of safety and ethics in public schools in different ways. So Dr. Ramirez will approach it from a perspective of future educators and teacher training, and then what can actually be done in the classroom. He has years of experience of teaching in public education, as well as here in teacher education at UVU. Dale Cox will present from the perspective of administration. He is our professor over our educational leadership program, where he trains principals and administrators in public schools. And then Kaylee will approach this from the perspective of school counseling. She just joined us. We're super excited to have Kaylee with us as part of our faculty. And she is starting a school counseling program here in the School of Education. So that's just a brief overview. I'll turn the time over to them. Axel, would you like to start with a little bit more formal introduction of who you are? And then we'll go to Dale and Kaylee. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Happy to start. Just for the record, I've been at UVU for 20 years now. And before that, I was a public school teacher for 12 years in secondary schools. But my focus right now is I teach elementary social studies methods, reading in the content area, and I'm teaching a lot of introduction to education courses, which I'm loving. My focus will definitely be on the classroom. You're going to get a snippet of the kind of things I share with my undergraduate students to try and get them ready to talk about the difficult things in the classroom. Anyway, the difficult things in the classroom, and so you'll see how that plays itself out throughout my slides.
So, excuse me, I'm Dale Cox. I joined UVU just 2 years ago. It's my third year to help develop and teach in the new educational leadership program that UVU established. It leads to principal licensure and a master's degree. Previous to coming to UVU, I spent 25 years in public schools in Mesa, Arizona, where I was teacher and administrator. And then immediately before coming here, I spent 13 years in China working with international schools and developing new international schools and overseeing existing ones in China and Thailand and other parts of Asia. Now our new program is in its third cohort of new administrators in training and moving forward in some really interesting ways.
Okay, great. My name is Kaylee Crandall, and I just barely started with the school counseling program here at UVU. And before my time working at UVU, I've actually been working at the Utah State Board of Education, and I was the project support specialist for the Safe and Healthy Schools Department at the Utah State Board of Education, and I was there for the past 6 years. And that's what I've done ever since I actually graduated with my degree in school counseling. And so that's just a little bit about me. I'm excited today to talk a little bit more about what school counselors do to keep schools safe. I want to start out today, though, by telling you a story. So if we want to go ahead and go to this first slide. Okay, so I know that this is a true story because this story was actually about me. When I first started 6th grade and as a first-time student at the middle school, I was so excited because I loved having friends. I was super social, and having all of the kids come from all of the other elementary schools was just something that I was so excited about. However, after just a few weeks of school had started, my excitement soon changed. My English teacher actually started making these frequent trips out of the classroom and wanted us to just stay quiet and work on our assignments while she would leave. I still don't know why she had to leave or where she was going or really how anybody could trust a room full of 12-year-olds. But nevertheless, I was really surprised by these frequent and reoccurring absences. What surprised me even more, though, as this new student in this new school, was the fact that every time the teacher would leave, two of my classmates would start swearing across the room and telling these stories that were just so crazy, and everybody in the class would feel so uncomfortable. So, as this kept happening more and more, there was one day where I finally looked around and you could just see everybody was just so uncomfortable, and they were trying to do their work, but nobody could really focus. And I finally had enough. And so I asked these two girls if they would stop swearing and stop saying these things. And when I asked them, silence just filled the room. Everybody was so quiet and the tension was so thick that you really could cut it with a knife. But to everyone's relief in the class, the girls actually did stop. And actually for the rest of the year, they never did that again. And everybody worked on their assignments quietly because the teacher would continue to leave. This would be a really great story if that's where it ended. But unfortunately, that is not where it ended. The two girls, they did stop. However, soon after, rumors started to spread that their friend was going to now beat me up. At first, it didn't really bother me much. I just kept telling myself, this will blow over. It's not a big deal. It's not really going to happen. But soon, as the threats became more frequent and more intense, I started to find myself actually struggling to think about anything else. Focusing on my classes was harder. School became harder, and really middle school was just nothing like I'd expected. After going through this for about 3 months, a fight was finally planned for one day after school. I said my goodbyes to my friends at lunch because I knew that my 5-foot self would never have any chance of making it out alive against this girl who wanted to fight me, but I really felt like there was no other choice. So 10 minutes before the end of the school bell rang, I got called down to the counseling office, and my school counselor sat me down and told me that one of my friends had actually let her know that there was a fight planned after school. And so she asked me, is this true? I told her that, yeah, I think this is, but then the tears just started to flow, and everything that I'd been experiencing the last few months was now out in the open. And I remember my school counselor making me feel cared about and safe. So there was no fight that day. In fact, from that day on, I was never bothered by anyone again. And I was finally able to enjoy friends, learning in middle school. So this experience taught me the powerful influence a school counselor can have, and actually influenced my decision to go into the field. Okay, next. So in today's schools, getting help's never been easier. So in 2016, the Safe UT app was actually rolled out, and it was developed by this Safe UT Commission, which is chaired by the Attorney General's office in the state of Utah. It was rolled out for all middle schools, junior highs, and high schools in Utah. And since that time has expanded to now go to pretty much all higher education institutions, and even the military now has access to this Safe UT app. Okay, next. So this app is free to use, and it provides real-time crisis intervention by letting students, parents, and educators start a chat, submit a tip, and even start a phone call with a licensed technician at the University Neuropsychiatric Institute, also known as UNI, and it's available all the time, so 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. You can go to the next. So these chats and tips are sent to these clinicians, and these clinicians can actually offer mental health services related to depression, anxiety, suicide prevention, drug and alcohol problems, self-harm, loss and grief, bullying, cyberbullying, relationship issues, or any other life challenge. And the great thing about this app is that the tips are anonymous. And so Students can reach out for themselves if they feel like they're struggling, or if they have a friend who they feel is struggling, then they can also reach out for that friend. Okay, next. So the non-urgent tips, they're actually submitted. So after working with the clinician at uni, the tips are then submitted to the school. The non-urgent tips go to administrators and school counselors who can then follow up with those students. The urgent tips are actually sent to law enforcement if there's a serious need so that they can get the help right when they need it. But anyway, this is just a great app that they can use. And you know, it's so important because it's a well-known fact that students can't succeed in school if they don't feel safe or if they struggle emotionally. And so Safe UT can really be used to help all kids, including those who are silently suffering, whether it's bullying, like was in my case, or really any other issue. Okay, next. So again, so who is using Safe UT? As of 2019 and 2020, we can see from this chart that almost 88% of middle schools to college-age students have access to this app, and 100% of high schools and middle schools have now enrolled, which is just fantastic. And I know even at UVU, if you walk around, there's these Safe UT flyers with the information. And so really trying to get that out there and let these students know that this resource is available is so important. In fact, so 85% of higher education institutions also have enrolled with this app. So next. So also according to that same report from the 2019-2020 school year, there was 8,000 total tips received during that school year. And if we look at this chart, we can see that almost 60% of the tips were related to either suicide or bullying. So most of the tips were actually related to suicide. However, there was still a significant number of tips related to bullying. That's about 3 out of every 5 tips. And if you break the numbers down even further, that's over 5,000 tips submitted by students in Utah in just one school year related to just those 2 issues. This is significant because Utah consistently ranks well above the national average for suicide deaths. And actually, as of 2018, it was actually ranked the 9th highest in the nation. The good news is that suicide and bullying are both preventable. Okay, go to the next. Okay, so you may be thinking at this time, what does all of this have to do with school counselors? Because don't school counselors just change schedules? Hopefully that's not what you're thinking, but if it is, the role of school counselor has drastically changed over the past few decades, and a lot of school counselors are now being labeled the mental health experts of the field or of the school. This role is extremely important as we continue to see this rise in mental health issues in the state and nationwide. And school counselors are specifically trained to help with bullying, suicide prevention, and even just helping a kid who's having a bad day, whose friends are being mean. They can all go in and see the school counselor. So let's go to the next. So as we can see from this list, there are many things that school counselors do to help students feel safe, improve social and emotional health, and create a positive school climate. So school counselors are actually uniquely positioned to reach 100% of the students. So they teach classroom lessons that help all students develop an awareness of healthy balance of mental, social, emotional, and physical well-being, identify and express feelings, help them develop healthy relationships, understand the need to accept and be accepted by others, and demonstrate skills for decision-making and problem-solving. Those are all taught in classroom lessons in collaboration with the teachers in the school. They also provide individual and small group counseling that facilitate these same areas and these same topics. And also another thing that a lot of school counselors in Utah do is implement a Hope Squad. So maybe you have heard about that. The Hope Squad program is a peer-based support program that partners with local mental health agencies. And within this program, the peers select students who are trustworthy and caring individuals to join the Hope Squad, and then they reach out and look for students who are struggling and try to offer them assistance and help and get them the help that they need. They provide friendship and they identify suicide warning signs, and they can get them help from adults. So the goal of the Hope Squad is to actually reduce self-destructive behavior and youth suicide by training, building, and creating change in schools and communities. School counselors also provide training to those who work with the students, including family, faculty, and staff, and they partner with the community to provide the necessary resources that students need. So looking at this list, which strategy do you feel would be the very most effective in helping students feel safe at school? So all of these strategies can be successful when implemented correctly. However, what probably makes the most difference is when a school counselor can just let a kid know they care. I know that my school counselor cared about me and my well-being, and that's why when she heard that there was a fight, she immediately resolved the situation and made sure I was okay. That's why school counselors, when they get an email from a parent who just found out that they have cancer, they immediately call the student down just to let them know that they're there for them. And if they need anything, they have a person that they can reach out to. Next. So as I mentioned before I worked at UVU, I had the opportunity to work with Christy Walker, who is the Utah State Board of Education Safe and Healthy Schools Coordinator. So Christy also has a background in school counseling, and as well as years of experience working in her role as the Safe and Healthy Schools Coordinator to promote a positive school climate. So I reached out to Christy last week and I asked her, what is one of the most important things a school counselor can do to keep kids safe at school? And she said the following: a school counselor plays a vital role in creating conditions for a safe school, and one of the primary impacts of that role goes unseen. It's felt and intensely impacts school climate. The school counselor radiates empathy in action, which is compassion, a connection and a lifeline to those who are struggling, and a safety net for those that are thriving. So again, the power of just compassion and one caring adult letting somebody know that they're there for them can't be overstated. Next. This quote, as Christy told this to me, reminded me of an experience I had at a counseling conference a couple of years ago. So at this counseling conference, I was first introduced to Josh Shipp, who was our keynote speaker. Josh told the story about when he was a young kid. He was a foster child, and he had been kicked out of so many homes by the time he was 13 that it actually had just become a game to him. And statistically speaking, he shared that he really should have ended up either dead, in jail, or homeless. And so he asked the question, how did he avoid becoming another statistic and instead a successful writer and influential speaker? His answer was one caring adult. So Josh first met Rodney, his new foster parent, and he wondered how many days it would take for him to get kicked out because he was just obnoxious and ungrateful. And he even said that he would set things on fire. One day when Josh was 17, he went to a bank and opened up an account and wrote $10,000 worth of checks. He got pulled over later that day, and because he didn't have insurance, was actually sent to jail. So after bailing Josh out from jail, Rodney and his wife sat him down and said, "Son, you can keep causing problems and pushing us away, but you've got to get this through your head. We don't see you as a problem. We see you as an opportunity." It was then Josh realized that this guy really meant what he said, and he really cared about him, and that changed everything. Josh also shared the statistic that in March of 2015, Harvard Center on the Developing Child released a study that said every child who winds up doing well has had at least one stable and committed relationship with a supportive adult. Okay, next. So school connectedness is defined as the belief by students and adults that peers in the school care about their learning as well as them as individuals. And research has shown that youth who are more connected to their school have better attendance, better grades, and higher test scores. So school counselors strive to develop these relationships with students and be that one caring adult that will then help students feel connected to their school. Okay, next. Several years ago, a study was conducted to determine whether or not and to what degree school counselors can increase school connectedness for kids and act as protective agents to mitigate the negative impacts of risk factors. So this study looked at over 5,000 students in 7th through 12th grades, and the researchers were able to establish that students who feel that their school counselor knows them personally and responds to their concerns, they are much more likely to report that there is at least one adult in their school that they can talk to about a problem or concern, and that they feel safer at school. So effective school counselors create this safe school environment, and they reduce the barriers to student achievement and learning. So when these barriers are eliminated, students can actually enjoy school, even middle school, and they can focus on what really matters, and that is gaining the education and skills needed to succeed academically and in a future career. So with that, I will turn the time over to Axel to talk more about teachers.
Hey, thank you, Kaylee. Wonderful job on that. I think whoever's listening to this will see a little bit of both of us in my presentation. So even though mine seems to be focused on social studies educators, it applies to just teachers in general. So I think everyone from K-12 can get some important concepts from the things I'll be discussing about today about teaching civility and civics in the classroom. Next slide, please. And before I forget, I'm on the lazy boy now. My wife told me not to be, but I have some sciatic pain, so it'll be a lot. I'll be a lot more able to focus if I'm in this reclined position. So I apologize for that. I'm also setting my stopwatch to make sure I don't go over. So when we're talking about civics and civility in the classroom, I always want my students to start off with the idea that we're supposed to be teaching civics and character education in the classroom. And in fact, we have to. It's actually in Utah code, and it's been there for many decades, but this is the newest iteration of that. And you can read it for yourselves, but basically, we're supposed to teach kids how to be good kids, whatever that means. This fleshes out a little bit of that. Again, it's not we can if we want to, it's we must. And it doesn't just say social studies teachers or counselors or administrators, it's every teacher that's supposed to be a model and teaching kids about civics and character education. Next slide, please. So if you're gonna do this right, you obviously need to prepare. And so I'm gonna try and give some very practical tips on how to do that, develop safe classrooms, talk about the difficult things, including character and civic education within the classroom. And again, this applies to all. Next slide, please. So one of the first things that you need to do and talk about before you do any of these things is to say, make sure there are ground rules that everyone agrees with. An easy way that teachers do throughout the country is to set up a classroom charter or a contract. Sometimes they're called we agree statements. And the reason that's so important is because at the very beginning of your classroom year, you'll say something like, students, I want to know how you want to be treated in my classroom. And I'm also going to tell you how I want to be treated in the classroom. And we talk about these, we put them on the board, and eventually we'll see that we all kind of want the same thing. We want a safe classroom when we're really learning about things. And this is how we're going to do it. And what that does is later on, when you will have problems with your students in terms of acting up or other things, because kids are kids, you can direct them to this classroom charter and just remind them that, hey, we agreed on this. This isn't me from top down telling you the way this class is going to be. We agreed on these things. And so when they're breaking the rules in quotes, they're actually breaking their own rules. And so that changes the dynamics of the classroom and how students see that they're supposed to conduct themselves, because they realize that kids really do want to learn. And if we follow these agreements, then we can all learn better. Usually when I'm talking to the students about creating this classroom charter, I'll bring them the golden rule, and I'll make sure that they understand that's not some Christian copyrighted statement. Every faith system and those that do not follow a specific faith religious system believe in that golden rule. I'll always mention it this way because I taught middle school, and the golden rule, the way I want them to remember it is treat others the way they want to be treated. Because with middle school kids, when you say things like treat others, people the way you want to be treated, they'll say, well, I don't care if people are mean to me or something like that. And so as a result, that works a little bit better. And I also bring up part of the Williamsburg Charter from 1988. And I just love it, so I'm going to read it out loud. Rights are best guarded when each person guards for all others those rights they wish for themselves. And I just think that's such a powerful statement. And I present those two things first before we create our charter. And all the years I used it, it worked very well. Nothing is perfect, but it is as sound practical advice as I can give you. And the research, of course, supports that. Next slide, please. So before I talk about these two slides, I just want to give you a little bit about my background, because that's why I think these things are so important. I was a a latchkey kid. And what that meant is when back in the 70s, when I came home, my parents were at work. They left around 6 or 7 in the morning. They came back around 6 o'clock at night. So I was basically by myself. And I know, so for some people of this generation, that sounds like awesome. But back then, there were only 3 channels on TV. And during the afternoon, you're going to get a lot of soap operas and those kind of things. So you really were just stuck by yourself. And by the way, I realize that being a latchkey kid now could also mean it's a lot harder because of the media influences out there. I'm not downgrading those, but my point is always when I'm training my students is to help them realize that when I left in the morning, there were no parents. And when I came home and at home, there were no parents. There was no one saying good morning. There was no one there to ask me how the day was. And so when I'm teaching teachers how to teach, I always think of those kids that just don't have the support through no fault of the parents, but there's just not a support at home, or they may be in more of a dysfunctional home. And so when you're going to talk about the tough stuff and have these difficult conversations, and you've established those charters, try and do something every day where a kid feels valued. I believe that K-12, every kid should be greeted when they come into the school or at least the classroom. And you can do fun greetings or real casual greetings, it doesn't matter. But just the idea that at one point during that day, someone's going to say, hello, I'm glad you're here. And I just think every kid needs to hear that because kids sometimes don't hear that at home. Giving kids an opportunity to share and talk, do things in groups. And what becomes important with group work is that those groups change around so that students have a chance to meet others in the classroom and engage with them in a nice, safe space. And then when it comes to literature circles, it's the same type of idea where if you're rotating roles and discussing difficult things or just regular curriculum, every kid that comes prepared serves um, a valuable role for that group for them to get a deeper understanding of the concepts. And if you do literature circles right, in a small, safe space, you also give students a chance to lead. And there are many times where kids, we want them to be leaders, we want them to be socially active, but we don't give them practice in the classroom to do such things. So by mixing and matching kids and giving them different roles and telling them that if they do prepare, they're going to really help the group, you're building that group cohesion. You're telling those kids that they matter, and that coming to school and the way they're going to help with these sharings and literature circles, that it's going to make someone's life a little bit better. And so they're a valuable person. And I think when we set up a classroom that way, it's much more easy later on to talk about those difficult things in class. Next slide, please. So, of course, you need to plan curriculum, make sure that you know that your objective, if you're going to talk about these difficult things, what your objective is, make sure you're following guidelines that are set up by the district. If there are no guidelines for the tough things in the district, please push to create some because every district has some and we have districts that have great models of them. Of course, we're always going to be neutral. We want to use multiple perspectives. If they're going to find their own sources to talk about the tough stuff, and that means we need to teach them media literacy beforehand. So a lot of times when you're teaching, you almost feel like if you're going backwards, but the reason is you want to make sure that kids have the skills and dispositions to bring into what they're doing. And then probably the most important thing, and this is the research is just pointing to this a lot, is if you're going to be talking about things in the classroom that could be considered controversial, you want to make sure you have that transparency with administrators and parents so that they know what's coming up, because a kid, when they go home, they'll say, this is what I learned in class, and they may not remember it the way you want them to remember it. But if the parents know it's coming or they've had a chance to explore the materials ahead of time, then everybody's feeling easy because they know as a teacher, you don't have some kind of hidden agenda. And if you think that the things you're going to talk about are going to be really controversial, then please talk to your administrator ahead of time. And he or she can help you understand whether, how to maybe put those in a different format, or if at the very least, if they get a phone call, they're prepared for what might be coming on the other side of that phone call. So it's really important that you plan thoroughly where you're going to go with this. Next slide. You're going to ask yourself before you teach, do the students have the knowledge, skills, and dispositions to handle this? Of course, age appropriateness is very, very helpful. Making sure that students may need to know how to disagree with someone when they're having a discussion. And so you might have to, again, go backwards and pre-teach this. For example, do students know they can say something like this? And I know it sounds old-fashioned, but doing this in the classroom, I'm telling you, it alleviates so many problems to say, I respectfully disagree with that. I see your point, but students don't even know that those are the first 3 words that they can say when they can disagree with someone like that. Or if they're not clear on what someone means, we practice and teach with them to say the phrase, could you rephrase that statement? I didn't quite understand. And it's just those things that we can actually teach help so much with the difficult discussions and keeping our classroom safe. Next slide, please. So during those discussions, you also want to make sure and say, do the students know where we're going with this? We're not just yelling at each other, but where are we going? Do they realize that we're trying to find some common ground? Debates, I know they serve a place, but in a classroom, a lot of times we try to find what's this common ground that we can all kind of agree with. But we've done that already with our classroom charter, so students can see the benefit of those building common grounds. Make sure that when you're talking about the difficult stuff, you refer back to those ground rules and charters before. And if someone goes off in the wrong path, we can say, hey, hold on, that's not something we agreed to. That doesn't meet the things that we agreed to. And so we need to not do that, and we refocus what's going on. Sometimes during talking about difficult discussions, students might go off script, and those are good times to remind them that hey, our objective, what we're trying to do right now is focused on this thing. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to talk, I'll write that down. We might talk about it at a later time, but for now, let's stay on the topic that we've all agreed on. It's really important with students when you're going to have these difficult discussions that a lot of them aren't used to talking with other people about difficult things. We know that a lot of times in our families right now, we can't even have family discussions without some people getting irate. And so we might have to develop these skills in smaller groups and slowly lead on to bigger groups. And what you'll find that if you do that, when your students have practiced with these smaller discussions, they're more likely to join in on the larger discussions that we have because they've already rehearsed it in a safe, smaller space. It's important to give kids time to think. We'll always have students that will be able to answer our questions before we're done asking them. But there are some students that just need time. And in all of our classroom teaching courses, we always talk about wait time, and that's okay to have that silence before we start talking. And of course, pre-writing might help with that as you're talking about these difficult things. And then this last one, I know sometimes gets me in trouble, especially with secondary teachers, but sarcasm is something that for some students is really difficult to understand and handle, especially when it comes from an adult. So that's something that you might actually want to address in those charters and talking about students that, sarcasm, it might play a role outside of the classroom with your friends that understand where you're coming from, but there might actually be students here that really don't understand and can't see through sarcasm. So maybe that's not something we're going to do during our discussions of these difficult things. Next slide, please. And then finally, the end. What are we hoping for with all of these things that we're doing between the counselors and administrators and of course our classroom teachers? And that I know that these slides aren't big enough to really see, but I hope that you see that you look them up. If you'll just Google Utah's Portrait of a Graduate, our State Office of Education has put together these goals that we can be doing in steps from K to 12, but the outcome is to have these great knowledgeable citizens that can participate in career and civic life in a way that we would all feel comfortable with. And so they do have things like their content matters a lot, but so do issues such as respect and service. So I hope that you all will later on today check out Utah's Portrait of a Graduate and think about the grades that you might want to be teaching and see what your role is towards building these students that come away from our Utah schools and are just awesome and are able to participate everything in a civic and ethical way. Thank you very much. I'll turn the time over now to Dale.
Thank you. I'll be talking about these things from an administrative perspective. And I won't be presenting any quick formulas or ideas, but to kind of look at the context of ethics and values and conflict and peace in the school from the perspective of administrator, and how it's changing and what the demands are and how we might address it. And that's certainly an important part of the program. And training of a principal in today's world is to address those things and be prepared to deal with some of the challenges. These are turbulent times. The society around us obviously affects how schools function, and the things that challenges and divisions and beliefs that exist in the external environment come to school in a variety of ways. What we see in the current environment is a decreasing consensus. There are things are more fragmented. There is less of a consensus around curriculum and around the role of schools and the role of teachers and the whole host of the things that happen inside a school. And yet, in all of that, taxpayers still build schools to educate children and for their learning and growth. And the administrator's challenge is to deal with all these complexities, but maintain that focus on student development and student learning. And that is not simple to do. Next slide, please. School is the one place where it all comes together in some respects. It's a place where everyone is connected by law. All children are required by compulsory education law to come to school. And because of that, schools get used for a variety of things that are not related to student learning. We deliver food. We feed children in schools who otherwise wouldn't be fed. We enforce immunization laws that have been in the books for measles and mumps and whatever. We deliver social services to students in schools. Medical services in some places are being delivered to students in schools. Groups who have a particular agenda for social, political content issues see school as the most important place to promote their agenda. And so there are all sorts of influences coming to bear on schools in terms of what's taught and how it's done, and Axel's address some of those. And then we have the fragmenting dynamics of our society that Kaylee's talked about, and the conflicts and challenges that come to school. All of it complicated by some changes in the overall context of society. In 2005, Thomas Friedman wrote this book, The World is Flat. It had a big influence on me and a lot of other people. It was a bestseller. But his point, at least in part, was that the 21st century was a century in which things were shifting from institutional access, or institutional control rather, to open access. And there was a flattening of the hierarchies of society, whether it be in finance or in politics or in economics, to a situation where anyone can market on the internet. You don't need to go through an institution. Anyone can self-publish a book on the internet. You don't have to go through an institution. School, the delivery of education is changing as well, as you don't have to go to a brick and mortar school for an education anymore. And so this flattened world has dramatically influenced what happens in school. A couple of years ago, these folks, Hymans and Timms, published this book, New Power, which is, in my mind anyway, is a kind of a second or an update on what Friedman talked about in the flat world. With this flattening of the world, I'll read their list of things. We are now hyper-connected. The world is focused on uploads rather than downloads, focused on individual power and voice rather than institutional power and voice. The world is focused on the crowd as a source rather than trained or specialized elites being in control. The world is focused on being transparent with everything and being open, as opposed to having closed or contained structures and control. Scope of control. So with all of that, you get more voices, more varied voices, different kinds of influence, and a lot more access. And all of that then has a dramatic influence on what happens in school. Next slide, please. Here's an example of how the flat world can complicate things for schools. In this case, you may have heard about it, an update to somewhat of a landmark case this year in the Supreme Court. A cheerleader who failed to make the cheer squad went to a convenience store after school and posted some profane and vulgar things about the school, not anyone individually targeted, but just about her failure to make the cheer squad. The school suspended her and punished her for that, and went finally to the Supreme Court, which said that students' free speech rights were being violated by the school's actions, and her position was upheld. Lines blur in the digital world. Time and place boundaries are change, and the questions now that the school administrators have to deal with are dramatically different, because if something happens off campus, a digital bullying can happen off campus, out of school time, and yet be viewed on campus or influence campus and so forth. So the digital world is changing the context of school peace. Next slide, please. The administrator's challenge then is to find a balance with these competing voices, with these competing priorities and different challenges and changing contexts. The administrator has to try to find a balance that maintains stability and peace in the school and allows learning and growth to continue. And that indeed is the challenge that we try to prepare administrators for. How do you understand the context and the issues that exist in your community? How do you manage and stay ahead of the shifts that are happening in society and values? How do you manage the multiplying communications that are occurring in the digital world, the fragmented constituencies that all want a piece of the school's action? Next slide, please. What is happening and has been happening for some time is a multiplying of roles, as Kaylee talked about, school counselor, and how that role has become increasingly important. I know in the years I was a principal of schools, we worked hand in hand with the counselors to address these issues, try to address them proactively. But the school administrator now is a personnel director, a finance leader, is a lawyer dealing with legal issues and legal challenges and lawsuits or threats of them and so forth, a judge and arbiter between different groups and in conflicts between students and teacher issues and so forth. The school administrator with the counselor becomes a social worker dealing with personal issues and challenges that students and their families face. One of the stickiest issues to deal with in my years as principal would be the custody battles, where the problem is at home, it's between the parents who are divorced or divorcing, but the child's at school. And both parents have different priorities and different approaches, and they both want to control what happens at school, putting the administrator and the counselor and the school squarely in the middle of a social problem at home. School administrators are often and frequently involved in law enforcement types of things, whether it's in drugs or violence or weapons and other things that may come to school from the external society that they have to then deal with, and often filling a parental role for children who are getting in trouble and having difficulty and don't have support at home. And so it's a complex challenge. Next slide, please. This balance question then becomes things, what is the balance between student rights and school safety? That's somewhat of what the Supreme Court was looking at in the cheerleader case. Was student free speech versus the school's argument that it was disruptive to have her saying those things were a violation of their codes for cheerleaders. What are the boundaries for social media? They cannot be used in positive ways. What are the boundaries for negative use of it? Because bullying just seems to get sharper and harsher when they can hide behind a device, and all kinds of odd things happen. What about the political issues that split our society? Again, people with different political priorities and agendas want access to schools, and they want schools to conform to or represent their points of view. How do you balance that? And social, emotional health, family issues, and so forth. So you have the principal has to be a lot more than just an expert in education. Next slide, please. One example of how things are shifting and schools are having to shift, and then you have to manage the implications of it. 25, 30 years ago, the emphasis in society and in schools was zero tolerance. there had been a spike in gang violence and drugs and so forth in society, and zero tolerance was the byword. The movement now, those for restorative justice, and I'll talk about those in a minute. How do you balance that? What's zero tolerance emphasizes the rights and protection of the victim, if you will, while restorative justice emphasizes the welfare and the growth and the humanity of the perpetrator. And they're not mutually exclusive, but how do you work? And sometimes they are mutually exclusive. Student rights and school safety, where are the boundaries, and how much right does the school have to intrude on students to ensure that they're not bringing things to school and so forth. Complicated questions that have legal implications, social implications. Next slide, please. So zero tolerance, when it was implemented, was that one drug offense and you get mandatory penalties that are harsh, and one weapon offense and you get mandatory penalties that were harsh and often required changing schools and so forth. It was a reaction to the threat and the intrusion of things that were threatening. And it had some value in cracking down on behaviors and so forth. But I remember on more than one occasion when I would deal with a student who had been on a scout camp, had put a pocket knife in his backpack and forgot it was there, came to school with this pocket knife, and I had to suspend them for an extended period of time because it was zero tolerance. The other side of that, next slide, please, is a much more nuanced, much more compassionate approach now of restorative justice, of working with people who make mistakes, students who make mistakes, to address in a growth mindset of helping them improve, to restore and recompense rather than punish. So it's a growth focus rather than a punishment focus. But it also means that sometimes somebody punches your kid and now they're not penalizing that person the way the parent of the victim wants it done, and the administrator is the input in the middle of that. So these are balances that the administrator is trying to seek. Next slide, please. I've mentioned social media. Again, it just has all sorts of implications and is a really messy thing to deal with from an administrator's perspective. If you have a school lockdown and every child's on their telephone shooting out their version of it to the community, or if you have viral rumors and things that they get out and so forth. So social media complicates the whole thing, blurs the lines and the boundaries, and raises all sorts of challenging questions for administrators. Next slide, please. Other issues that you have to strike a balance that are currently challenging: gender policies, DEIJ issues, critical race theory is a divisive issue right now, political issues and divisions and questions and elections and all the disruptive things that have been going on. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip over this slide, but it's just another example of how Facebook, there is now statistical evidence and evidence that Facebook knew it, that Instagram has a negative effect on the mental health of teenage girls, especially who use it. And so again, what's the school's role? How do you balance that? Because they will post about school, and school things will end up on Instagram. Next slide, please. Just some headlines of issues that have recently been going on in Utah. So the Salt Lake School Board adopted a gender inclusion policy, trying to address those issues proactively. The Utah School Board is currently studying when students can use a new name or pronouns for gender identity and recommendations for schools. Utah schools Utah okays rules for teaching about racism. Just before the school starts again, how are you going to teach these things? And Axel has talked about some of those challenges. The high profile situation we had at the beginning of this school year, with the teacher goes on the political tirade and loses her job. The transgender athlete bill will be coming back to the legislature and be fought over again. Again, obviously has extensive influence on what happens in schools. A mom and other parents are suing the governor over school mask mandates and all the COVID issues. And so it's a complicated thing. So next slide, please. What is the solution? How does the school administrator manage all of these competing things and issues and challenges? And next slide. There is no formula, there is no quick fix, but there are principles and practices that allow you to manage these things successfully. Building foundations of trust with all the constituencies of the school, like Axel said, the transparency. a focus on the why. Why are we here? What is the important? What are we doing here at school? And keeping the focus on learning and growth, strengthening relationships across the school and the community, and building that trust and that understanding, seeing the whole system, looking at structures and relationships and the politics of simple, and seeing them as a whole rather than as individual things allows you to manage them more effectively. Listen and learn, listen and learn, listen and learn. It's a constant learning process, a constant listening and growing process. You can't just pronounce edicts and expect things to work. It's an interactive, iterative process. And in that process, you lead and create change and build harmony in relationships. And there are so many examples of strong schools who have been able to manage this successfully. So that's a quick look at the administrative perspective, and I will be done. Thank you.
I gotta make sure I unmute. Okay, thank you so much to our panelists. Let's see, I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen. If I can figure out how to do that. Stop share, okay. And I do have some questions for our panelists that have come through the chat. Hey, can Axel, what time are we supposed to be wrapping up?
We're wrapping up at 11:15, so I can say that if some of us individually don't have time for a question that's really a burning question for anyone in our audience, I feel I can speak for Dale and Kaylee in saying, please, you feel free to email us and follow up with some of those questions, or we also have office hours if you want to discuss any of these things, just in case we don't get to everything.
I appreciate that. And all of these panelists are, like I said at the beginning, professors in the School of Education. So if you go to the School of Education at UVU and click on faculty and staff, you can find their contact information. So the first question, and I think I'm going to direct this to Kaylee, and this comes from the audience. What if keeping peace in the hallway or classroom results in violence outside of school for students being targeted by others?
Yeah, and I'm grateful that you asked me that question because that is something that we see, and you know, a lot of the issues that we see do happen at home as well. And so that's what's so great about that Safe UT app is that it doesn't just have to be something that happens in the school, because we know that if students are struggling with some of these issues outside of school, it's still going to impact their learning, right? And so if you are dealing with some of these issues, even if they are outside of school, I would highly recommend you to use that Safe UT app to at least, if it's not for yourself, for somebody else, but then get them that help that they need.
Yeah, I appreciate that because we know that schools exist within a bigger context, right? And those things are going to happen. And I believe that educators should care about what goes on beyond. Axel, I think I'm going to ask you this next one. How do you decide if you handle, and the other panelists, please feel free to jump in if you have any comments to the questions, if I'm not even directing them to you. But this question, how do you decide if you handle conflicts with only students? When do you involve parents?
Speaking from a classroom teacher, I always involve parents. I want parents to know what's going on in my classroom for the good and the bad, because a lot of times kids will go home. I hope they go home and report what's happening in the classroom. So I want my parents to know that, I know what's just happened and here's how we handled it, so that they can then talk with their own children at home. I know that parents are the primary caregivers, and they should be that, but they can't do that if I, as a teacher, don't inform them to what's going on.
Kaylee, go ahead.
Yeah, and I was going to say, from a school counseling standpoint, if you have students that are coming in and they have some of these issues, you do have to be careful that school counselors don't offer some of these services without getting written parental consent. And that's just in the law. That's the PPRA law for school counselors. There's 8 protected areas that if a student comes in and they start talking about any of those areas, you actually should at that point stop them and let them know that you do have to have parent permission before you can help them work on that area of conflict.
Thank you for sharing that. I would love to get Dale's perspective from an administrative standpoint on this as well.
It's been well said. Obviously, with child protective issues, there are specific notice or not notice situations in case of child abuse or something like that. So there's specific law in that particular instance. In other instances, I think the default is involve the parents. As children get older, how and when, what that might look a little differently for juniors or seniors in high school who are having an argument versus younger children. But most of the time, the default is try to involve parents and inform them. There may be exceptions. There were parents I've dealt with over the years where I knew if the parent that it was going to create serious issues for the child at home. And there were occasions, rarely, when there was another judgment to make, but it's certainly not where you want to be.
Thank you. And I thought this was an interesting question from the audience. How do you best help kids that feel like their conflicts aren't being heard or aren't being resolved, even if they do go to their teachers or their administrators? The reason I think this is interesting is sexual identity was the topic of my class yesterday in my multicultural education class. And some of the statistics that we saw are very disheartening. And one of them in particular is that 71% of bullying cases that are reported to teachers or administrators nothing is done with those. That's how that statistic is being reported. So does anyone have any thoughts on how to help students when they feel like they've tried to express their concerns or issues that they have, but they're not being heard, perhaps?
I'll start with a little bit. I think one of the things I always try and tell students when there's conflict or issues is that I have to respect the privacy of the other people involved in this. And as a result, things are happening, things are being done. I just can't tell you about them. And that's a real frustration for our students and parents of the other parties. But it's just, we have to protect those privacy rights on both sides. I know that happened with a situation I had with my own daughter who was being sexually harassed at school because I had reported, but I also understood that the principal, vice principal in this case, they couldn't tell me what they were doing, but I trust the system enough to know that there are things going on behind the scenes that I'm just not aware of, and that, kids aren't going to tell what's happening either. So I think we need to explain kids, that's part of the solution, is to explain the rights of all parties in this.
And Axel identifies a key thing there that I mentioned in my discussion, the trust. On in an individual case, you would hope they would have a place to go with someone in the building that they felt would be listening and be able to advocate for them if they feel like their own efforts have failed. To prevent that kind of a content of the situation developing, though, is if you have built trust and confidence with the leadership and the students and the teachers, and that speaks to the culture of the school that is built up over time and so forth. And if that is strong and effective, then I think you would have less of what you described, Brian. But I spoke with, we had a guest speaker from Salem Hills High School who, after student suicide, one of the focuses that they had, or foci, I should say, I suppose, was that to check name by name to make sure every student had an adult who knew them and would advocate for them. And they went through the whole school that way and tried to make sure that every student had that connection. And Kaylee talked about the importance of that. So that would be one way. Then you could have, for a student who feels marginalized and not helped, would have someone they could go to.
Thank you for that. Kaylee, this next question I'm going to direct to you. What would you recommend a counselor do if you know a child needs help, but don't seem like they want it or refuse your help? And I actually have a follow-up question of my own after. Let me just let that go though first.
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. And I was thinking before I get to that, back to the previous question, school counselors should have a list of referral services. And so if students come in, or if people need help in some specific area and it's something that you're either not familiar with or you don't know the answer to, you can give them that list of referrals, which maybe may get them a little bit more specific help of what they need. As far as when students come in saying that, you know, here's a student that they need to change, but they're not just doing it. I think that's one of those situations when you use some of the counseling training that you've actually been given and you ask them some of those, you know, motivating questions, right? Like, you know, why you ask them why questions, you help them come to their own conclusions that they need to change for themselves, right? Because you can't ever force somebody to change if they don't want to change. And so I think that's kind of where that counseling background comes in.
Thanks. And so a question I was thinking about yesterday as I was preparing for this, kind of related to that, you know, there's often a stigma around in our society that we've built up about going and asking for help. Or what is it like for a student who is in the principal's office or maybe the counseling office? Any ideas of how to break that as a culture in the school to make it more comfortable for students and safe?
Yeah, I think the best thing that school counselors can do is start making their face available, right? I mean, you sometimes have these school counselors that just, if they just sit in their office and they're never dealing, you know, they go teach their classroom lessons and they're not making themselves seen any other time. I don't think the students will feel comfortable to go and talk about those things. But if you have a great school counselor that's in the halls and they're saying hi and they're just going on their own to make themselves known to these kids, they can start developing those relationships, which will then allow students to maybe feel more comfortable getting that help from them.
I like that. Thank you very much. So to any of you, if you have any thoughts on this one from the audience, if a student is being cyberbullied online outside of school, when should the school get involved or how should the school get involved?
Speaking to that from the administrative perspective, is one of the key things would be first to have something written and clearly identified that is legally defensible in terms of when the school is involved. And if that's in writing in the student handbook or in some kind of student policies that are public, then you're in much stronger ground to be able to intervene if it's stated, and it probably has to be something along the lines of, if it's disruptive to the school and the functions of the school and the success of the school students, then the school will take appropriate action. Some kind of a basis for intervention, and then and some criteria that maybe wouldn't be published, but then it's saying, okay, and then it's case by case once you have those principles in place.
Thank you.
I should say too, I'm sorry, one other thought, that there's also the question of, you know, from a principal's perspective, are you intervening in a disciplinary way as opposed to a counselor's perspective? Are you intervening in a supportive way? And hopefully those aren't mutually exclusive, but it's easier to do the supportive thing than the disciplinary thing from a legal standpoint.
Yeah. Anything? I don't see a hand. Anything to add from anyone else on that?
Yeah, I would add for a classroom teacher. I mean, a lot of times it's just about having you're going to have those relationships with students a lot because you have a smaller set of students that you're responsible for. So it's important that you have that relationship with the student, but also this is the type of thing where if a teacher's aware of what's going on, this is where you do bring the counselor and the administrator in. So there's always that transparency between the groups, because if we don't tell as teachers anyone else, then this can continue, or it might be continuing in other areas, and there's not the communication between the three systems that we have presented here. I will say one thing about a past comment, though, your question, Brian, about if they don't want help, or how do we make this more, I don't know. Here, I'll just give you my thoughts. I'm a Latino male, okay? And I think that I need to model for my students this idea that it's okay to ask for help. Culturally, sometimes that's not something that's done with men, especially men from a Hispanic background, but I think we need to be more human to our students and let them know that, hey, I've had these issues and I've gone for help. I've had children that have mental health issues. I've had a daughter that was sexually harassed. I talk about those things because I let my students know that, you know, I may not have experienced everything that they have or the way they're experiencing it, but I've also had situations where I've asked for help. And I think that's a good thing to model for kids.
Yeah, thank you, Axel, for that. All right, I know that we're getting close on time. I love this question. I think we'll leave it as our last one, but I have to ask it. It is, where is the line between teaching students to be good kids, quote unquote, and pushing on our own morals on them? The reason I love this question so much is I talk a lot about in my multicultural education class about where we get our reality or our perceptions, our perspectives on life, right? And a lot of those are based on our habitus, our cultural characteristics that we're born into. And we just kind of grow up thinking that the way we view the world is the right way. And so I love this question because it's challenging that idea of what does a good kid mean? How do we do that? How do we balance what we believe as teachers or administrators or counselors, maybe when it doesn't connect with students?
I'll start with that since I think I probably brought up that phrase, good kid. I think there are some universal values that 99.99% of us can agree with. And if you look at the Utah Code, if you look at the Golden Rule, the Williamsburg Charter, those kind of things, there are just some things that and even that Utah Portrait of a Graduate, where we can talk about being kind and respectful and loyal. And those are things that 99.99% of us agree with. And so if we're talking from the sphere of universal values, then that's going to get us away from this idea of just this is what I morally think is right and you should be this way. You should be a mini me. So I think approaching it that way is part of the answer.
I know for school counseling, in our program at UVU, one of the first classes that school counselors take is this theories of counseling course. And in that course, the school counselors are actually challenged to examine some of their assumptions and some of their biases. And that's so important for school counselors to actually realize those, because as you are working with students, you do need to make sure that you don't have those biases impact the work that you do with students. Because I like what you said, Brian. You know, it is one of those things that we all have our beliefs, and you know, of course, we believe that the things that we believe are the truth, right? But everybody may not agree with that. And so I think as a school counselor, you have to be aware of that, and in that role, be sensitive to that fact, but realize those biases that you may hold, and make sure that you don't impose your beliefs on the other student.
I absolutely love that. And I think that that's a great way to end. Dale, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I have an even better way to end.
Great.
Well, I alluded to the fact that schools may be the only institution in society where we bring everybody together now. And that can create conflict, but it creates a great opportunity. And these questions are worth working through and worth addressing and worth doing well, because for many students, the school is the strongest institution in their life and the most stable influence in their life. And so there is an opportunity in school and in schooling to do the things we're talking about here, and that may be the best opportunity for us to do it. I don't know if that's better than your ending or not.
So what I love it. I equally love that as a place to end, Dale. Thank you so much. I've to our audience, thank you for joining us today. I've posted the emails of our three presenters. They have a lot of free time, so just bombard them with emails and questions. No, they are very busy people, but they would be happy. Any of us would be happy to answer any other questions that we didn't get to. And if we didn't get to your question, I do apologize, but we're very grateful for Dale Cox, Kaylee Crandall, and Axel Ramirez. And thank you all for joining us. And please continue to enjoy Ethics Awareness Week.
All right, just